You think living with strangers is harmless? Think again. These are the 3 scariest true roommate horror stories you've never heard. I lived through all of them. I'm not embellishing. I'm not trying to be dramatic. I'm just telling you what happened the nights I learned how thin the line is between a house and a trap. I was in my early 20s in the first one. Fresh out of school, renting a house with 3 other grads to split the bills. We were young, tired, a little broke, and we wanted privacy more than we wanted company. Most nights were quiet. Dinner, work, a show, sleep. The kind of life where leaving a shower curtain ajar was a domestic crime, and the loudest argument was over who did the dishes. KJ was the quiet one. He kept to himself. Not hostile, just distant. He had these eyes that never quite looked like anyone was home, wide open, attentive in a way that made you uncomfortable. People described him as reclusive. He worked odd hours, then he disappeared on weekends. He'd come back at strange times. At first I didn't care. I'd moved in to pay rent, not to build friendships. I told myself boundaries were healthy. Then things started to change. A pair of roommates moved out within a month of each other, and suddenly the house felt emptier. It was just KJ and me most nights. He began going out later, coming back at hours that made the house creak differently. You notice that when there's only 2 people left. The house sounds more like a living thing than an apartment. On one late night I was half asleep on the couch when headlights swung across the living room wall. Someone had driven up and was idling under the window. It was late, 1:15. I assumed KJ had a friend. I heard the front door open and the careful hush of someone moving through the house. Then I heard KJ freeze in the hallway. His footsteps stopped. His breathing slowed. And when he stepped into the living room, he looked at me with those same wide open eyes, like he'd seen something too real to talk about. He didn't say anything about the car. He moved like someone who wanted to avoid asking a question. He opened a kitchen drawer with shaking hands and started rifling through it. He glanced at me once and said, "Do you have a wallet?" It was the strangest request. I was still groggy. He asked me the exact color of my wallet, as if he'd seen it somewhere. I told him, and he kept searching drawers, a nervous animal in a kitchen he didn't know. That night the oddness pushed me on edge. The car idling outside left after a while. KJ fell asleep quickly on the couch, eyes open for a few seconds, and then gone. I tried to go back to sleep, but something in my chest had changed. The house had been violated in a quiet way. I told myself to let it go. A week later, near midnight, he knocked on my door. Not softly. Not like a roommate asking to borrow soap. He was insistent. He said he'd lost something, his wallet, his keys, and he wanted me to help look. I told him I had work, an early shift, and that I needed to sleep. He pushed harder, said it was important, said he couldn't find his wallet and he was late for work and could I please come help locate it. Something in the tone didn't line up with the words. It was not the tone of someone embarrassed by misplacing something. It was the tone of someone asking for help as cover. He asked me to come outside. I told him no. He kept talking, louder now, edging toward pleading. I finally got up. We walked into the yard. The night was thick with the smell of wet leaves. The street was dim. The house was the only home with a light on. He led me away from the porch into the trees that hugged the boundary of the property. At first it was a short walk, the kind of path people take to smoke or to get away from a party. Then the path got narrow. The trees closed in. My phone had no signal. I remember thinking it would be a quick look and then back to bed. He kept going. He kept insisting I keep pace, like he was guiding me somewhere he'd already decided on. I was telling myself to tell him no. This is where common sense should have been louder, but it was late. He had that stare. He'd been my housemate for months. The ground was soft, and the only sound was our shoes and the distant hum of someone's TV. I told him I thought it was a bad idea, and he laughed it off. I asked him why we were in the woods at midnight, and he said, "You just said you'd help. Come on." I realized then that whatever he was doing, it wasn't about a wallet. His hands were trembling, but not from cold. He looked at me with those wide open eyes, and for the first time I felt like the thing I was dealing with was not my roommate, but a stranger wearing his face. He pointed to a patch of ground and said, "It must have dropped here." I knelt to humor him, because that felt safer than walking farther into the dark. My knees hit the soil, damp and smelling of rot. He was behind me. Close. Too close. I didn't look up. I started to stand, and in that moment, the hairs on my arms rose. I felt the angle of his hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a friendly touch. It was a hold. A test. He whispered something, too fast to make out, and then shoved me backward, just enough to make me stumble. I remember saying, "KJ, stop. This is not funny." I remember the words tasting like a plea. He didn't laugh. He moved again, slow and deliberate. And then he did something that ripped any remaining casualness out of the night. He took off running toward the deeper woods as if he'd realized something and had to get away. I sat on the ground, heart hammering, and watched him vanish like he had never been there. I got up and ran to the road and to the porch light. I packed a bag. I left that night, and I never went back. I slept in my car until daylight, driving to a friend's place before heading to work. I called the few people I trusted and tried to make sense of what had happened. I called my landlord. I texted 2 other former roommates. Nothing came of it. KJ didn't respond to messages. I never found out where he went. I never reported him. I wasn't sure I could explain the night without sounding paranoid. I didn't have proof of intent. I only had the way his eyes looked and the way he led me into trees. I left the house with the thought that maybe I had imagined parts of it. But the bag in my car and the smell of damp leaves under my nails said otherwise. I slept with the lights on for a week. I moved out 2 months later. I thought I had moved on. But sometimes, on quiet nights, headlights across the living room wall make me flinch. That's all I was left with. A memory, and the question of what might have happened if I'd gone deeper into the woods with him. If that unsettles you, good, because the next one gets worse. If you want the next 2, hit subscribe. These only get darker. After the woods incident, I thought it couldn't get stranger. I was wrong. Story number 2 was a college house horror, and it started with floorboard creaks at 3 in the morning. I was sharing an off-campus house with 3 other guys after sophomore year. Jason was my roommate for the main bedroom. We weren't close friends, just cordial. We shared a beer now and then, traded quick help with classes, that kind of college familiarity. He was a good roommate on paper, paid rent, kept his side tidy, sometimes brought pizza home. It took a while to notice the pattern. It began with sounds that didn't add up. At around 3 a.m., I would hear floorboards creak, but the pattern didn't match anyone moving through the house. It sounded like someone walking from the back of the house to the front, slow and measured. We'd both wake up sometimes. I'd think it was him going to the sink or returning from a late class. He'd be in his bed. Later, I would see him in the doorway, sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the hallway with a cup of tea as if he'd just woken. But he hadn't left the room. One night it was particularly persistent. The creaks traveled across the house, and then stopped right outside my room. I lay frozen, listening. My apartment had thin walls and a forever echo. Every small sound felt magnified. I told myself not to look. But curiosity is a poor substitute for caution. I cracked the door thinking I'd catch someone skulking or a roommate playing a prank. The hall light was off. The living room lamp left a dim pool of light near the stairs. I saw a shadow, the wrong kind of human shape, standing at the foot of Jason's door. Slender, tall. The figure didn't move like someone who had just walked in. It stood like someone waiting. The hair on my neck lifted. I watched it for a long breath, and then it turned its head toward the stairwell. I'd been sure I was cornered in a bad dream, until it moved, and the shadow stretched into a man. He was tall and bearded, the kind of scruff you assume belongs to someone with a job where shaving is optional. He wore a coat, though it was late spring. He stood in Jason's doorway like he owned the place. I pulled my door closed and locked it before I realized what I was doing. My hands were shaking. I texted Jason, "Are you in your room?" No reply. The next thing that broke my breath was the sight of Jason sitting up in his bed when he finally texted back. He sent a message. "Dude, what's up? I'm up, couldn't sleep." His message had a timestamp that matched my watch. I looked at the time. He had been in his bed the whole time. I went back to the door. The man was gone. The hesitation of that moment was heavy. I didn't want to open the door. I told myself I'd wake Jason gently. Maybe he'd heard something. Maybe he'd seen the shadow too. I knocked and he answered, rubbing his eyes. He blinked at me like someone interrupted his sleep. I asked him if he'd seen anyone in his room. He said no. He had been home the whole night. We compared notes, measured timestamps in our heads, and couldn't reconcile anything. Then the next night the creaks returned, more insistent. It seemed to move across the house in a pattern like someone pacing. At one point the footsteps were directly above my head. I had a sinking feeling that someone was touring the house, memorizing it. At 3:12 a.m., a slow shadow passed under Jason's door. Then silence. I lay awake and wondered if it would happen again. The following week I was up late grading a paper. My phone lit the room and cast an ugly blue light. I heard a soft sound from downstairs like someone shifting. I told myself to ignore it. The sound got louder and paced closer. I crept to the door and peered down the stairs. The living room was dark. By habit, I clicked on the porch light to check the yard. It flicked on, and through the window I saw nothing but the silhouette of trees. I went to Jason's door. I opened it without knocking. The room was darker than the rest of the house. Then I saw him. The man, tall, bearded, stood in the corner of Jason's room. He was motionless, as if frozen in an accidental photo. He wore the same coat I'd glimpsed before, and he was looking down at the floor. For a moment I couldn't reconcile the sight. Then he turned toward me slowly, like he had been listening for me. His face was in shadow. I can't describe his expression because there was almost no visible detail under the dimness, but I felt a chill like metal against my spine. He took one step toward me. I stepped back and nearly tripped over my desk chair. The man's movement was deliberate. He walked past me, through the doorway, and into the hall, moving as if he knew where everything was. I shouted without planning to, "Hey, who the hell are you?" My voice cracked. He didn't answer. He didn't stop. He walked down the hall and out the front door. He left the door unlocked on the way out. I stood frozen on the stairs, heart pounding so hard it sounded like someone hitting a drum in the room. I called 911. I called Jason. I told the operator there had been an intruder in the house and that he had just left. The police came. They searched. They found the front door unlatched and an open window upstairs. Nothing else. No sign of forced entry beyond that. We sat with the officers while they took our statements. Jason was pale, quiet. He kept telling them he'd been asleep. He said he heard nothing. The police took pictures. They checked for fingerprints on the door. They said someone probably left through the window and ran. No arrests, no suspects. They told us to be vigilant. They advised locks and calling immediately next time. They were professional, but their words felt thin. We had an intruder who knew the house. The window was only slightly ajar, just enough for someone familiar with the layout to use. After that night, none of us slept more than a few hours without waking. We installed extra locks. We bought motion sensor lights. We checked each other's rooms when we woke. I kept replaying the man's posture in my mind. Some nights I woke to the sensation of eyes on me by the hallway. We moved out at the end of the semester. Jason moved into a place nearer to campus. I don't know if the intruder had been waiting for someone or if he picked our house at random. I never saw him again. The police never found him. The window remained their only lead, a clue that meant something to the one who used it, and nothing to us. You start to wonder how someone could be in your home when you are there and no one notices. You start to question every creak. That second story flipped the switch from eerie to targeted. It made me understand that vulnerability is not only about who wants you. It's about who knows the rhythms and can slip into them. And then there's the last one. The woman who wasn't who she said she was. I still think about this one most nights. There was a Craigslist ad. Remember when people still used Craigslist to find roommates? It was 2015. I needed a new place and I needed someone to split a 3-bedroom. Hannah's message seemed perfect. She said she was 23, moving for work, quiet, tidy. She asked a few ordinary questions and gave a low-key charm in texts. We met at a coffee shop. She wore a simple jacket and talked in a measured way. She said she liked keeping to herself, but was friendly. I liked her at first glance. There was nothing that raised flags, no crazy stories, no wild demands. At first, she lived exactly how she'd described. She was polite. She kept her door closed. She bought a small rice cooker and hid it in her closet like someone who treasured privacy. She left notes for us about the trash. Nothing seemed off. Then small things happened. I'd wake up and find my bedroom door unlocked when I'd clearly locked it. Once I found my laptop on the desk where I'd left it, but the desktop wallpaper had been rotated to a different image. Nothing stolen. Nothing damaged. Just small intrusions that felt like violations without a clear perpetrator. I chalked up minor annoyances to absent-mindedness. Friends told me not to be dramatic. I didn't want to be that person who made wild accusations. Hannah seemed genuinely apologetic when I mentioned doors left open. She said she must have tripped the latch by accident. I accepted it because asking further felt awkward. It escalated faster than I expected. One night, I woke because the room felt too cold. I glanced at the clock, 2:40 a.m. I pulled the covers and tried to sleep. Then I heard a sound by the door, the little creak of a hinge. I held my breath. I had locked the door. The handle turned anyway. The door opened slowly and a shadow stepped into my room. I thought it might be a nightmare. The shadow moved, and then I realized it was Hannah. She stood in the doorway with her head tilted, as if looking for something she'd misplaced. The light from the hallway haloed her silhouette. She was wearing a long coat, even though the house was warm. She looked at me for a beat, then took a step into the room, and then turned and ran out like a child who'd been caught doing something wrong. It took a minute for my heart to stop trying to leap from my chest. I pulled the covers up to my chin and sat still for what felt like an hour. I didn't want to believe she'd been in my room. Maybe she'd come upstairs to put something away and forgotten the door. But the next morning, a neighbor said they'd heard footsteps that night, soft like someone tiptoeing. I started to keep a log in my head. Times, small changes in the apartment, things I noticed when I left for work. The entries piled up. Door unlocked, towel missing, and found folded on a chair. A lamp moved an inch. I confronted her politely after a week. I asked if she'd been in my room. She looked embarrassed and said she might have opened it by mistake. Her voice was low. She swore she'd never take anything. I wanted to believe her because otherwise the alternative was terrifying. But there was a smell sometimes when she came in. A faint chemical tang, like someone who had been somewhere else and brought a shadow back with them. Then one night changed everything. I was brushing my teeth late because I had been up with a project. I finished and went to my room. The hallway was dark except for the glow of the streetlight slipping through the blinds. I locked my door and sat on my bed to read for a few minutes. I was about to shut off the lamp when I saw movement at the corner of my eye, a shadow under the door. The crack of light under the door elongated like a bruise. I felt the blood drain from my face. I opened my bedroom door a fraction and saw her standing in the corner of my room. Not by the doorway, not just peeking. She was in the room, a silhouette in the darkness, as if she'd been there long enough to learn the layout without needing a lamp. For one heartbeat, I thought she was going to speak. Instead, she moved, then froze with her hand lifted like she'd been mid-step. Then, without warning, she spun and bolted down the hall, slamming her own door so hard the picture frames rattled. I grabbed my phone and called 911. The operator asked if I saw her leave. I told them I had, and she had slammed her door and was inside. The police arrived within what felt like minutes, and much longer at the same time. They knocked and called her name. Her door was locked. They announced themselves. After a few minutes, she cracked the door and spoke in a quiet voice. She said she was tired. She was having a breakdown. She apologized for scaring me and would move out if that's what I wanted. The officers asked for ID. She handed over a small card. That's when things unraveled in a way that made my stomach drop. The name on the card didn't match anything she'd told me. The phone she'd given us for contact was a burner. No long-term record, no steady history. She had been living there under a false name. She packed her things in the middle of the night. She carried most of her stuff out quietly and left a single bag. She moved out within 24 hours, and when the officers called to follow up, the number led nowhere. The workplace she'd claimed to be headed to didn't have her on file. The apartment she'd said was her previous residence had no record of her. A few days later, I discovered that one of her social media profiles had been scrubbed clean. She had ghosts where a background should have been. I filed a report. The police said they'd take statements and look into her identity. Their conclusion was the same as my own fear. Unknown. They had limited leads. She had left without a trace and no permanent contact. I moved out shortly after. It was the kind of violation where you feel naked in a place that should be private. Thinking back, none of her actions were technically violent. No theft, no forced entry, just invasion and deception. And yet the effect was the same as any more sensational harm. She had been inside my private space without consent and under a false identity. The psychological cost of that was heavy. The uncertainty of it was worse than concrete threat. You never know why a person like that chooses a house like yours. You only know you were chosen. All three of these stories share a single frame. The domestic is not always safe. They share faces and spaces that looked ordinary until they didn't. They share unanswered questions. KJ led me into the woods and then vanished. I left the house with only a bag and a feeling that I'd been lucky. Jason and the tall bearded stranger reminded me that physical intruders can be methodical and that a partially open window is a language someone else might already understand. Hannah, or the person we called Hannah, showed how identity itself can be weaponized. Small lies, a fake name, a burner phone, and a pattern of invasion that left no easy trail. None of these stories ended with justice. None of them wrapped up neatly. The police did what they could, and then the investigations closed into the same grief. Unknown. That ambiguity is a kind of cruelty. It forces you to live with fragmentary evidence and the ways your imagination fills the gaps. It forces you to consider what could have been done differently when you don't even know the real risk to begin with. But there are a few things I did learn. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Not everyone will take you seriously. That's frustrating and sometimes infuriating. Sometimes you'll be the only person who listens to the small hairs on your arms. Call authorities when there's an immediate threat. Leave if you feel unsafe. I'm not telling anyone to become paranoid or to carry fear in their pockets. I'm saying be careful, lock doors, keep records of odd things, change routines. Find a friend who can be a quick backup. Don't stay silent because you worry about being dramatic. Your safety matters more than other people's doubts. But most of all, keep your boundaries. Share less than you think you have to when you meet someone new. Keep important documents and valuables in a place only you know. Notice the little things. If a person's story has holes that don't add up, if their age, job, or references are vague, don't dismiss that as a quirk. It can be a warning. I don't tell these stories to terrify you for the sake of clicks. I tell them because they happened, and because the scar of uncertainty lingers. The nights of headlights, the creaking floor at 3 a.m., the shadow under the door, those images live with me in small reflexes. I lock the door twice now. I leave a light on sometimes. I ask questions. I keep moving. If you've lived with someone scary, tell your story in the comments. Share something you learned that could help someone else. And if you want more unheard true tales like these, subscribe for the next set. These aren't just stories. They're reminders that sometimes danger wears a familiar face and that the only defense you really have is attention and the willingness to act when something feels wrong. I never found the answers to the questions those nights raised. I don't know what KJ's plan, if he had one, would have been. I don't know why the man in Jason's room picked our house. I don't know who Hannah thought she was, or wanted us to think she was. Maybe I'll never know. Maybe you won't either. That's the cold part, the not knowing. But the knowing part, the part that keeps you safe, is to listen to the small sounds and have the courage to leave the house, call the police, tell someone, pack a bag, change the locks. The rest, the other part, is human and flawed and messy. We survive it by paying attention. If these stories struck a chord, share them with someone who rents with others, or anyone who might need that little shove toward making safer choices. And again, tell me about your roommate horror in the comments. I read them. I'll read yours.